Ma'am, that seat isn't yours. Real VIP guests are arriving, so I'll need you to move. The words sliced cleanly through the quiet hum of the executive lounge, loud enough to pull every nearby conversation into silence. Coffee cups paused halfway to waiting lips. Laptop screens were forgotten. Travelers dressed in tailored suits glanced toward the woman sitting calmly beside the floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the private runway. Naomi Brooks slowly lifted her eyes from the leather notebook resting on her lap. She wore dark jeans, clean white sneakers, and a charcoal sweater without a single designer logo. There was nothing flashy about her appearance, and that was exactly the point. She had walked into the lounge 42 minutes earlier using a perfectly valid executive boarding pass. Greeting every employee with the same quiet smile she offered everyone she met. No one had recognized her, and she hadn't expected them to. Across from her stood Melissa Grant, a senior lounge attendant whose polished smile had already disappeared. Instead, her expression carried the practiced confidence of someone convinced appearances told the whole story. Behind Melissa, a middle-aged white businessman adjusted the cuff of his navy blazer and sighed dramatically. "If she isn't supposed to be here," he muttered just loudly enough for several people nearby to hear. "Why are we wasting everyone's time?" A few uncomfortable chuckles drifted across the lounge. Naomi remained seated. She simply folded her notebook closed and looked directly at Melissa without raising her voice. "Is there a problem with my reservation?" she asked. Melissa barely glanced at the boarding pass Naomi extended. "There's no problem," she replied flatly. "This seat has been reassigned for a priority guest." Naomi tilted her head slightly. "I was under the impression this was my assigned seat." "Not anymore." Melissa crossed her arms. "Sometimes accommodations change. I'm sure you'll understand." Naomi's expression never changed. Outside, a private jet rolled slowly across the tarmac beneath the bright Florida sun, its polished fuselage reflecting streaks of light through the massive windows. Inside, however, the atmosphere had shifted. The room no longer felt luxurious. It felt like a stage where everyone had silently chosen a side before hearing the facts. Naomi looked around the lounge for only a moment. She noticed the receptionist avoiding eye contact. She noticed another attendant whispering into a headset while glancing in her direction. She noticed a young employee near the coffee station staring at a computer monitor with growing uncertainty before quickly looking away. Every detail mattered. Every reaction mattered even more. The businessman stepped closer, rolling his expensive suitcase beside Naomi's chair. "Ma'am," he said with a tight smile, "some of us actually belong in this section." His words lingered in the air longer than anyone seemed comfortable admitting. A woman seated across the room frowned, but said nothing. Another traveler lowered his newspaper, watching carefully without speaking. Naomi slowly placed her boarding pass back inside its sleeve. "I see," she answered softly. Melissa interpreted the calm as surrender. "Wonderful," she said. "If you'll gather your belongings, I'll escort you to the standard lounge." Naomi didn't move. She simply rested one hand on the armrest and looked beyond Melissa toward the young employee, still standing near the computer terminal. For just an instant, their eyes met. The employee hesitated, glanced back at the reservation screen, then looked at Naomi again as if something on the monitor didn't match the story unfolding in front of everyone. Naomi noticed the hesitation immediately. She had spent more than 20 years building companies, leading negotiations worth billions, and studying people who believed confidence could replace truth. She recognized uncertainty faster than most people recognized authority. She offered the young employee a faint, reassuring smile before returning her attention to Melissa. "Before I stand up," Naomi said quietly, "I'd appreciate knowing exactly why my seat suddenly belongs to someone else." The question hung unanswered as the lounge grew even quieter, and somewhere behind the reception desk, another employee reached for the phone. Melissa's smile became noticeably thinner when Naomi did not immediately respond. The silence unsettled her more than an argument would have. People who protested could be dismissed. People who remained calm forced everyone else to think. She tapped her identification badge against the tablet in her hand and glanced briefly at the seating chart before locking the screen again. "Ma'am, I have already explained the situation," she said. "We need this seat available." Naomi nodded politely. "For whom?" Melissa hesitated for less than a second. "For an executive client." Naomi folded her hands together. Interesting. The businessman standing beside them gave an impatient laugh. Some people just do not know when to move on. His expensive watch caught the afternoon sunlight as he looked around the room, searching for approval. A few passengers avoided his eyes. Others simply watched, curious to see how the situation would unfold. Naomi noticed every face without appearing to study any of them. Years of leading boardrooms had taught her that people revealed far more when they believed no one was paying attention. Near the reception desk, the young employee looked back at the reservation system once again. His fingers hovered above the keyboard before stopping. Something on the screen clearly troubled him, yet he remained silent. Across the lounge, another attendant quietly approached Melissa and whispered something into her ear. Melissa barely listened before shaking her head. "It does not matter," she replied firmly. "The decision has already been made." Naomi heard every word. She also noticed the uncertainty spreading among the staff. Decisions reached too quickly often depended on assumptions instead of facts. She had witnessed that pattern countless times throughout her career. 23 years earlier, she had entered the lobby of a prestigious consulting firm for her very first executive interview. She had been wearing a modest navy suit she could barely afford after months of saving every extra dollar. Before she reached the reception desk, another visitor had handed her an empty coffee cup, assuming she worked with the cleaning crew. She had smiled, returned the cup, and continued toward the interview that eventually changed her life. She never forgot the embarrassment, but she remembered something even more valuable. The assumptions always arrived before the questions. Back in the lounge, Naomi looked through the wide glass windows as another aircraft taxied toward the terminal. She had chosen today's outfit for one reason alone. She wanted employees to respond to character instead of clothing. Luxury service meant nothing if dignity depended on expensive labels. Melissa finally lost her patience. "Ma'am, if you continue refusing to cooperate, I will have to involve my supervisor." Naomi answered with the same steady tone she had used from the beginning. "You should absolutely involve your supervisor." The unexpected reply seemed to catch Melissa off guard. She had expected resistance, frustration, perhaps even raised voices. Instead, she found herself facing someone who almost appeared to welcome additional oversight. The businessman shook his head. "This is unbelievable," he muttered, holding everyone up over a chair. Naomi turned toward him for the first time. "No, sir," she said gently. "People are rarely judged over a chair. They are judged by the reasons others think they should not be sitting in it." The words settled across the room like a quiet challenge. Nobody answered. Even the businessman looked away. Near the computer terminal, the young employee took a slow breath before picking up the internal phone, his eyes fixed on Naomi's name still displayed across the reservation screen as another message suddenly appeared beneath it, causing his expression to change completely. The young employee swallowed hard as he stared at the glowing reservation screen. Naomi Brooks. Executive access confirmed. Priority level 1. A second notification appeared beneath her profile before disappearing almost as quickly as it arrived, leaving him wondering whether he had imagined it. He lifted the internal phone to call his supervisor, but before he could speak, Melissa stepped beside him and pressed the receiver back into its cradle. "There is nothing to verify," she said quietly, though everyone close enough could hear her. "We are following procedure." The young employee hesitated. "But her reservation." Melissa interrupted him with a sharp glance. "Did you hear me?" He nodded reluctantly and stepped back from the desk. Naomi watched the exchange without saying a word. Her expression remained calm, yet she had already learned far more from that brief conversation than any explanation could have provided. Assumptions had become policy. Questions had become inconvenience. Across the lounge, the businessman rolled his suitcase directly beside the chair Melissa wanted Naomi to surrender. "I assume this is finally over," he said confidently. Melissa offered him an apologetic smile. "We are resolving it now, sir." He adjusted his jacket and looked toward Naomi again. "You know, there is no shame in admitting you walked into the wrong lounge." Naomi met his gaze. Confidence without information is an expensive habit. He laughed dismissively, believing he had already won. Several nearby travelers exchanged uneasy looks. An older couple sitting near the window whispered to each other. A woman in a gray business suit quietly closed her laptop, no longer pretending to focus on work. The atmosphere had become too tense to ignore. At that moment, another staff member hurried into the lounge wearing a supervisor badge. Daniel Pierce was known for resolving customer complaints quickly, and Melissa looked visibly relieved when she saw him approaching. She stepped forward before he could ask a single question. "This passenger refuses to move from a reassigned executive seat," she explained. "We have offered an alternative, but she keeps challenging our decision." Daniel turned toward Naomi with a practiced corporate smile. "Good afternoon, ma'am. My name is Daniel. I understand there has been some confusion." Naomi stood slowly, not out of submission, but out of courtesy. "No confusion on my part," she answered. "Only unanswered questions." Daniel accepted the boarding pass she offered. He glanced at it for only a moment before handing it back. Unfortunately, seating assignments occasionally change due to operational needs. Naomi asked, "Could you explain those operational needs?" Daniel hesitated. "They are internal matters. So, I am expected to surrender my assigned seat without knowing why." Daniel folded his hands. "We simply ask for your cooperation." Naomi looked around the lounge once more. Nobody had returned to their conversations. Nobody was enjoying the quiet luxury advertised by the company. Every eye remained fixed on the growing exchange. She realized the room itself had become the true test, not of her patience, but of the culture the employees believed represented excellence. Then the businessman took one confident step forward and reached for the handle of Naomi's carry-on suitcase. "If she will not move it," he said with a smug grin, "perhaps someone should help her." Before his hand reached the luggage, a clear voice broke the silence from behind the reception desk. "Wait," the young employee called out, his voice shaking but unmistakably firm. "I think we are making a very serious mistake." The lounge froze. Even the businessman pulled his hand back from Naomi's suitcase as every head turned toward the young employee. His name tag read Ethan Collins, and despite his neatly pressed uniform, the uncertainty in his face made him look far younger than he had only moments before. Melissa stared at him in disbelief. "Ethan," she said through clenched teeth, "this is not the time." He looked from Melissa to Daniel, then back at the reservation monitor behind the desk. "I checked the system twice," he said carefully. "Her executive access is active. The seat assignment has never changed." A murmur spread across the lounge like a slow-moving wave. Daniel stepped closer to the counter. "Show me." Ethan reached toward the keyboard, but Melissa immediately placed her hand over the monitor, blocking the screen from view. "The system refreshes constantly," she insisted. "You probably misread it." Ethan swallowed. "I do not think I did." Melissa shook her head. "You are still in training. Let the experienced staff handle this." Naomi remained perfectly still, watching the conversation unfold as though she were listening to a board meeting instead of defending her place in an airport lounge. She had learned long ago that the truth often arrived, quietly, carried by the one person with the least authority to speak. Across the room, the older couple exchanged worried glances. The woman finally stood from her chair. "Young man," she said to Ethan, "are you saying this lady belongs here?" Ethan hesitated only briefly before answering. "Yes, ma'am. Everything I saw says she does." The businessman laughed loudly enough to reclaim everyone's attention. Or perhaps he is simply confused. He looked directly at Ethan. "You are risking your job over someone you have never met." Ethan took a slow breath. "I am trying to do my job." Those 6 words settled over the lounge with surprising weight. Daniel looked increasingly uncomfortable. The confident smile he had worn when he first arrived had disappeared, replaced by the careful expression of a manager realizing the situation was no longer simple. He turned toward Naomi. "Ma'am, would you mind waiting a few more minutes while we review everything?" Naomi gave a slight nod. "I have been waiting patiently since this conversation began." A woman wearing a gray business suit closed the distance between herself and Naomi. "I watched the entire exchange," she said calmly. She never raised her voice. She never refused to cooperate. She only asked for an explanation. The older gentleman beside his wife nodded in agreement. "That is exactly what I saw." Suddenly the room no longer belonged entirely to the employees. Witnesses had begun filling the silence with facts instead of assumptions. Melissa sensed the shift immediately. "Everyone is missing the point," she said. "We are protecting the experience of our premium travelers." Naomi looked directly at her. "The experience begins the moment someone walks through the door, not when you decide they deserve respect." Nobody answered. Even the businessman seemed uncertain whether to speak again. Ethan looked back at the reservation monitor one final time. Another notification quietly appeared across the top of the screen, this one highlighted in gold. His eyes widened. He had never seen that level of authorization before. Before he could say another word, the reception computer emitted a soft alert tone that echoed through the suddenly silent lounge, and every employee instinctively turned toward the screen. The soft alert echoed once, then disappeared, leaving behind a silence that felt heavier than the sound itself. Ethan stared at the golden notification without touching the keyboard. His breathing slowed as he reread the words, uncertain whether he should say them aloud. Daniel noticed his expression immediately. "What does it say?" he asked. Ethan hesitated. Before he could answer, Melissa stepped between him and the monitor once again. "It is an internal system message," she said quickly. "It has nothing to do with this passenger." Naomi quietly observed the exchange. She had seen organizations succeed because people protected the truth, and she had watched others fail because people protected one another instead. The difference usually appeared in moments exactly like this. Daniel looked unconvinced. "Move aside, Melissa." She folded her arms. "There is no reason to create more confusion." The businessman, growing impatient, pointed toward Naomi's chair. "This has already gone on long enough. I have an international meeting in less than 3 hours. Someone needs to end this." Naomi looked at him calmly. Sometimes ending the conversation before finding the truth creates a much bigger problem. He shook his head dismissively. "You keep speaking as though you run the place." Naomi answered with the faintest smile. "Interesting observation." Melissa took another step forward. "Ma'am, I am asking you one final time. Please collect your belongings and relocate to the standard lounge while we complete our review." Naomi remained exactly where she was. "I have fully cooperated from the beginning. I checked in properly. I presented my boarding pass. I answered every question respectfully. I will continue cooperating with any legitimate review, but I will not surrender my assigned seat simply because someone decided I do not look like I belong here." Those words settled over the room with quiet force. Nobody interrupted her. Nobody laughed this time. Even the businessman lowered his eyes for a brief moment. The older woman standing nearby slowly nodded. "She is right," she said. "Respect should not depend on appearance." Naomi heard those words, and for a moment another memory surfaced with remarkable clarity. 20 years earlier, she had boarded her first cross-country business flight after closing the largest contract of her young career. She had paid for a premium seat with money she had earned herself. Before takeoff, another passenger had politely asked whether she would mind moving because his colleague preferred to sit there. A flight attendant had smiled awkwardly and suggested that Naomi would probably be more comfortable farther back. Nobody had checked the boarding passes until she quietly insisted. The mistake had eventually been corrected, but no one had apologized for assuming she was the person expected to give something up. She remembered staring out the airplane window that day and promising herself that if she ever had the power to shape customer service, dignity would never become optional. The memory faded as she looked around the lounge once again. Different airport, different faces, the same assumption. Daniel finally reached toward the monitor himself. Melissa instinctively tried to stop him, but he gently moved her hand aside. His eyes scanned the screen, and the color slowly drained from his face. Before he could react, the reception phone rang with a distinctive internal priority tone that none of the employees had heard before. Ethan looked at the flashing display. Instead of a department name, only 2 words appeared across the screen in bright gold letters: Executive Protocol. The priority tone continued to pulse through the reception desk every few seconds, not loudly, but with enough authority to make every employee stop moving. Daniel stared at the flashing display without answering the call. He had worked for the company for 11 years, yet he had never seen Executive Protocol activate inside a passenger lounge. Ethan looked from the screen to Naomi, then back again. The gold banner remained unchanged, waiting for someone to respond. Melissa forced an uneasy smile that no longer convinced anyone. "It is probably a system test," she said, though even she did not sound certain. Daniel slowly shook his head. System tests are never routed through an active guest terminal. The businessman crossed his arms impatiently. "Will someone please answer the phone?" Daniel reached toward the receiver, but before his fingers touched it, Naomi quietly spoke. "You should let it ring one more time." Every eye turned toward her. She remained seated with the same calm expression she had worn since the first accusation. There was no satisfaction on her face. No anger. Only remarkable patience. The phone rang again. Then the notification on Ethan's monitor changed. The simple gold banner disappeared, replaced by a single instruction displayed across the top of the reservation system. Await executive confirmation. Ethan whispered the words without realizing he had spoken aloud. Daniel's heartbeat quickened. Melissa looked confused. Executive confirmation for what? Nobody answered because nobody knew. Naomi reached into the pocket of her sweater and removed her phone. She unlocked the screen, read a short message, and typed only 2 words before placing it back in her pocket. She never made a call. She never explained herself. She simply waited. Ethan noticed that less than 5 seconds after she locked her phone, another notification appeared on the reservation monitor. Security cameras synchronized. Incident review initiated. Automatic record preservation active. He stared in disbelief. Those functions belonged to headquarters, not local lounge staff. Daniel stepped closer to the counter until he could clearly read every line himself. His face became noticeably more serious. Nobody touches this reservation, he said quietly. Nobody logs out. Nobody changes anything. Melissa frowned. Daniel, this is becoming completely unnecessary. He looked directly at her. No. What is unnecessary is making assumptions before verifying facts. The words hung in the air. The witnesses who had remained silent only minutes earlier now watched with growing curiosity. The older gentleman folded his newspaper completely. The woman in the gray business suit slowly smiled, sensing that the truth was finally beginning to catch up with the story everyone had accepted. Naomi looked through the windows toward the aircraft lined across the runway. She remembered another promise she had made years earlier after that first humiliating business flight. If she ever earned the privilege to lead, accountability would never begin behind closed boardroom doors. It would begin where customers were actually treated. Policies written on paper meant nothing if dignity disappeared at the front desk. That belief had shaped every acquisition she approved and every executive she promoted. Quietly, almost unnoticed, the electronic access panel beside the lounge entrance flashed blue instead of its usual green. 2 professionally dressed corporate employees stepped inside, carrying slim tablets rather than luggage. They did not rush. They did not speak to anyone immediately. Their eyes calmly scanned the room before settling on Naomi. Both stopped walking at exactly the same moment, exchanged a brief respectful glance, and then began making their way directly toward her while every employee instinctively stepped aside. The 2 corporate representatives stopped a few feet from Naomi before speaking. Both wore simple Navy business attire with discreet company badges that carried no department names, only executive credentials. The taller of the 2 offered a respectful nod. "Good afternoon, Ms. Brooks," he said. "Thank you for your patience." Every employee in the lounge became perfectly still. Melissa's expression changed from confidence to confusion in an instant. Daniel looked from the visitors to Naomi, searching for an explanation that suddenly seemed obvious to everyone except those who had ignored the warning signs. Naomi rose calmly from her chair and returned the greeting with a warm smile. "Good afternoon, Michael." "Good afternoon, Sophia." The 2 representatives acknowledged her with the quiet familiarity reserved for someone they knew well. Michael held a tablet against his side. "We received confirmation that executive protocol was activated at this location. The review team is standing by." Naomi nodded once. "I expected they would be." The businessman who had demanded her seat frowned. "Executive protocol?" he asked, his voice noticeably less certain than before. Nobody answered him. Michael turned toward Daniel. "Who is currently supervising this lounge?" Daniel slowly stepped forward. "I am." Michael gave a professional nod. "Please preserve all security footage, guest interaction logs, reservation history, and employee communications from the last 90 minutes. Headquarters has initiated a formal service quality review." Melissa's face lost its color. "Headquarters?" she whispered. Sophia tapped her tablet only once before looking directly at Naomi. "The chief executive office has already been notified." Those words settled over the lounge with astonishing weight. Several travelers looked toward Naomi at exactly the same moment. The older woman covered her mouth in disbelief. The businessman stared silently, trying to reconcile the woman he had dismissed only minutes earlier with the words he had just heard. Daniel felt his stomach tighten. He looked back at Naomi, remembering every moment since he entered the lounge. Every assumption, every missed opportunity to ask better questions. "Ms. Brooks," he said carefully, "may I ask?" Naomi finished the sentence for him with remarkable gentleness. "You were wondering why I never identified myself." Daniel nodded quietly. Naomi looked around the room before answering. "Because respect that depends on a title is not respect. It is recognition of power. I came here hoping to experience the same service every guest deserves, regardless of appearance." Nobody spoke. Even the soft music playing through the lounge now seemed distant. Naomi continued in the same calm voice. "This visit was scheduled weeks ago as part of an unannounced customer experience evaluation. I chose ordinary clothes because luxury brands should never determine the quality of service someone receives." Ethan lowered his eyes briefly, realizing why the reservation had carried the highest authorization level. Michael opened his tablet and confirmed another notification. "The Executive Review Committee is connected." Naomi nodded. "Good." She turned toward Ethan first. "Thank you for speaking when remaining silent would have been easier." Ethan looked genuinely surprised. "I only said what I saw." Naomi smiled. "Integrity usually begins exactly that way." Then she faced Daniel. "Leadership is not measured by how quickly problems disappear. It is measured by how honestly they are confronted." Finally, her eyes rested on Melissa and the businessman. She did not raise her voice. She did not show anger. She simply allowed the silence to reveal what every witness in the room had already understood, while Michael quietly opened the executive review file and prepared to begin the official evaluation in front of everyone. Michael placed the tablet on the reception counter where everyone could see it, although only the executive team could access the confidential details displayed on the screen. He looked toward Daniel first. "The review committee has authorized immediate action based on the verified incident log, security footage, reservation history, and witness statements that have already been preserved." Daniel nodded silently. There was no argument left to make. The evidence had accumulated long before anyone realized it was being collected. Naomi remained standing beside her chair with the same composed expression that had never changed throughout the afternoon. She was not interested in embarrassing anyone. She was interested in understanding whether the culture she had spent years building still existed where it mattered most. Sophia turned another page on her tablet. "The review confirms that Ms. Brooks presented valid executive credentials upon arrival. Her assigned seating was never modified. No operational changes justified relocating her. The request was based entirely on employee discretion." The words echoed through the lounge. Melissa lowered her eyes toward the floor. For the first time since the confrontation began, she seemed unable to speak. Michael continued reading. "The review also confirms multiple opportunities to verify guest information before taking action. Those opportunities were ignored despite concerns raised by another employee." His eyes shifted briefly toward Ethan. Naomi looked at the young employee with quiet appreciation. "Doing the right thing is rarely comfortable in the moment," she said. "But organizations survive because people choose integrity over convenience." Ethan nodded, still trying to process everything that had happened. He had arrived at work expecting an ordinary shift. Instead, he had become the one employee willing to trust the facts rather than assumptions. Naomi then faced Daniel. "You accepted responsibility after arriving, and you allowed the records to be reviewed instead of hidden. That matters." Daniel answered honestly. "I should have asked better questions before defending a decision I did not witness." Naomi gave a slight nod. "Every leader makes mistakes. The important question is whether they protect the truth or protect the mistake." Several passengers quietly applauded. It was not loud or dramatic. It was simply a natural response from people who had watched dignity prevail without shouting, threats, or humiliation. The businessman who had demanded Naomi's seat slowly stepped forward. His confident posture had completely disappeared. "Ms. Brooks," he said carefully, "I owe you an apology. I judged you before I knew anything about you." Naomi met his eyes without resentment. "I accept your apology. I hope the lesson lasts longer than the embarrassment." He nodded quietly and stepped back without another word. Then Michael turned toward Melissa with visible professionalism. "Effective immediately, you are being relieved of customer-facing responsibilities pending the outcome of the formal executive review. Human Resources will contact you regarding the next steps in accordance with company policy." There was no anger in his voice. No celebration. Only accountability carried out with dignity. Melissa closed her eyes briefly before giving a silent nod. Naomi watched her for a moment before speaking one final time. This review is not about punishment. It is about rebuilding a culture where no guest has to prove they deserve basic respect before receiving it. The room remained silent as those words settled over everyone present. Outside the windows, another aircraft lifted smoothly into the bright afternoon sky, while inside the lounge the atmosphere had changed completely. The luxury of the space no longer came from polished marble floors or expensive furniture. It came from the quiet realization that character, not appearance, was the standard that should have guided every decision from the very beginning. As the executive review concluded, the atmosphere inside the lounge no longer resembled the one Naomi Brooks had entered earlier that afternoon. Conversations returned slowly, but they carried a different tone. Travelers who had witnessed every moment looked at one another with quiet reflection instead of casual indifference. Michael closed the executive review file and confirmed that the initial findings would be forwarded directly to the company's board governance committee, where final personnel decisions would be completed according to established corporate policy. Daniel thanked the review team before turning to the employees gathered near the reception desk. Today reminded all of us that procedures exist to protect people, not replace judgment, he said. We will earn back trust through our actions, not our words. Naomi appreciated the sincerity in his voice. Accountability was meaningful only when it inspired change instead of fear. She picked up her leather notebook and carry-on bag, preparing to continue her journey exactly as she had planned before any of this began. Ethan approached her carefully. "Ms. Brooks," he said, "I almost stayed quiet. I kept thinking that maybe I had misunderstood the reservation." Naomi smiled warmly. Courage is not the absence of uncertainty. Courage is choosing honesty while uncertainty still exists. Never underestimate how much one honest voice can change an entire organization. Ethan nodded with genuine gratitude. He understood that lesson would remain with him far longer than any employee training manual. Nearby, the older couple thanked Naomi for handling the situation with grace. The woman in the gray business suit shook Naomi's hand and quietly admitted that she had seen similar moments throughout her career but had rarely watched someone respond with such calm dignity. Naomi answered simply, "People remember how power is used far longer than they remember who had it." Even the businessman who had apologized earlier remained standing near the windows, visibly thoughtful. Before Naomi reached the lounge entrance, he approached once more. "I have spent years believing I was good at reading people," he admitted. "Today showed me that I was often reading appearances instead." Naomi gave him a respectful nod. "The good news is that wisdom begins the moment we recognize what confidence alone could never teach us." He thanked her sincerely before walking toward his departure gate with a perspective that had clearly changed. Outside, another aircraft climbed steadily into the clear afternoon sky, disappearing into the horizon with quiet confidence. Naomi paused briefly beside the windows before leaving the lounge. She remembered the young woman she had once been, sitting alone on a flight after being asked to surrender a seat she had rightfully purchased. She remembered promising herself that if opportunity ever placed leadership in her hands, she would build organizations where dignity was never reserved for those who looked wealthy, dressed perfectly, or fit someone's expectation of success. Years later, that promise still guided every decision she made. Luxury was never measured by marble floors, premium coffee, or private lounges. Real excellence appeared in ordinary moments, when nobody believed they were being evaluated and every guest deserved exactly the same respect. As Naomi walked toward her departure gate, the lounge doors closed quietly behind her, but the lesson remained inside. Policies could shape behavior, training could improve performance, and titles could create authority, yet none of them mattered without character. Because true leadership never begins when someone reveals they are the chief executive officer. It begins much earlier, in the moment someone chooses to treat a complete stranger with fairness, dignity, and respect before knowing anything about who they are.